Hi, welcome to this panel titled David Against Goliath, the App Fairness Fight. To discuss those issues, today we have with us Mark Buse, Senior Vice President, Head of Global Government Relations and Policy for Match Group, and Andy Yen, CEO of Proton, and both are members of the Coalition for App Fairness, which is calling for principles for more fairness on app stores. So today we're going to speak about app stores. And to start, I'm going to start with you, Mark, with a mapping of the problem. So what is it that you're fighting about? Why are we here, basically?
Well, thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. And we're glad to talk about this issue because it's incredibly impactful. Consumers need this. Developers need this. And the problem is simple. The only way apps get to users is through two side-by-side monopolies, Apple and Google. It couldn't be more simple. And what we need to do is open that up, allow developers to have options, and let consumers have choice, which will result in lower prices.
Okay. Andy, what's your view on that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people look at this problem and they see the headlines of Epic versus Apple, and they say, okay, it's a $1 billion company fighting a $1 trillion company. But that's not really accurate, right? What we see with Apple and Google's App Store practices is essentially an artificially imposed tax on the internet, which if you own a smartphone, which is everybody in this room, we are paying, right? It's very easy to say only developers pay this tax, but actually that cost is for sure passed on to consumers. There's also an element of privacy, right? At Proton, we have two products, ProtonMail and ProtonVPN. And between them, we have 50 million signups. And there's two ways to do business online, right? One is via advertising, and this is obviously the dominant business model of the internet. The other method is subscriptions, charging consumers for their products instead of monetizing their data. And what a 30% fee in the app stores is doing is it's artificially favoring one model over the other, right? If you sell ads and you offer your app for free, you don't pay the tax. If you want to preserve privacy and sell subscriptions, you're forced to pay 30%. And this is slowly and surely, chipping away at privacy protections online by pushing app developers, towards business models that don't favor privacy.
Okay. And before we dive into potential solutions and fixes, let's zoom in on the latest developments, because there were a bunch of decisions on Apple's App Store, a new piece of legislation in South Korea, investigation in Japan, a court ruling in the US. Mark, are those developments helping?
They're huge. The dominoes are falling. South Korea passed a law, and it's a simple law, very simple. It just says you cannot force developers to use one system for payment. Couldn't be easier, couldn't be simpler. But that's only the beginning. The issue's been talked about for a long time now, and I think most people were always of the view that Apple and Google were too big to lose. But consumers are demanding this, developers are demanding this, and we're making progress. I expect fully the EU to act. I expect a number of countries here to act very soon. I think France could certainly move. I expect something potentially from the Netherlands or the UK. And in the US, the momentum has grown to such a point, the dominoes are falling. I think you're going to see a bill move out of the US Senate, at least out of committee, within 30 to 60 days.
And the South Korean legislation, Mark, could you explain what concretely is going to change for app developers?
What was so great about it is it was signed into law at the beginning of the month, and on the 14th, so last week, it became effective, period. It is against the law in Korea for Apple or Google to tell a developer how to build their product. So, I think that's going to drive employment. We're already hearing from other developers that they want to move operations into Korea. They want to hire more people. Match, we've made the commitment already publicly, we're going to lower prices, pass that on to consumers. We're going to invest in technology, and we're going to invest in hiring more employees on the ground. That's what this means. And when it's replicated, it's going to mean that everywhere this happens.
Andy, how do you assess those latest developments?
Yeah, I think it is very much a snowball effect, right? If people see that Korea, one of the largest, economies in the world, is able to do this, and disaster didn't strike, then the question becomes, why can't France do it? Why can't Germany do it? Why can't even the U.S. do it? So it really creates that opening for these discussions to happen. And what we also see is, as soon as European regulators start discussing and addressing an issue, then American regulators also pay attention and begin to work on that. Then you see, UK regulators saying, okay, we're getting behind. We need to catch up as well. So it's really, once it begins, it really starts to snowball. And I think this gives us the momentum to actually bring concrete change that really can improve the lives of developers and also everyday consumers.
And in Brussels, there's a piece of legislation called the Digital Markets Act that also aims to make it easier to basically. Anyway, you see what I mean. So how do you assess, Andy, the Digital Markets Act? Is it going far enough? Is it not enough? Is it too slow? How do you see those developments in Brussels?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the DMA, the Digital Market Act, it's actually very ambitious, right? We've obviously seen more ambitious and more effective legislation, for example, the South Korean one, coming up since then. But the DMA really was the first, national effort, if we will, or in this case, international effort to try to make a difference and legislate this particular issue. And on that, I think it was very effective in, blazing the trail and opening doors, right? Now, of course, more work has to be done. If we look at the DMA, today it's talking a lot about regulating app stores and things like this. So my view on that is a lot of that work is trying to fix an already existing problem as opposed to trying to prevent the problem in the first place, right? I'll give you one example. We know from studies that 95% of people will stick with the defaults on their phone or device, right? So if the default is always going to be, let's say, Google or Apple's own service, then that will, by default, create a 95% market dominance scenario. So if you don't tackle, for example, the default piece, you actually don't even address 95% of the problem. And this is why I think it's important that, we, of course, want to address the 5%, but we also need to get to the root of the issue. And I think the DMA, there are things that can be done there to actually strengthen it in that regard.
Mark, you're based in the US. How is the DMA perceived from the United States?
Oh, the US has a lot of respect for it. The Congress respects what they've done. Regulators in the US, in many cases, follow the DMA's action. The DMA has been more aggressive than many of the US regulators. So again, I echo what Andy said there, in that it had an incredibly positive impact. I do hope that everywhere where they're considering these issues, though, they don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And again, I'll go back to South Korea. Super simple, elegant solution. Replicate it. Will that solve all the problems? Absolutely not. There will be more. And technology will always create more problems as well. But we're breaking the dam. And that is going to open up all kinds of freedom and options that, to be honest, we haven't thought about. But some new small developer, the next Andy, is going to invent or come up with, and they're going to be able to run with it, and boom. And that's what we need. That's what the entire ecosystem needs.
And Mark, you were mentioning earlier the Netherlands and France, and which European countries do you see being the most aggressive on those issues?
Well, I hope all of them. And I think The Netherlands is, the ACM, their regulatory body, has made really good progress. We don't know anything in finality out of the Netherlands, but we wrote a letter to the officials there a week ago asking for an update, because we believe if you go down the path of just gauging from the clock, there should be an answer, and we expect something there imminently. Had the option, had the ability today to talk to a number of French officials. I think that French officials are moving forward aggressively and want to tackle the problem. I was talking to UK, the officials there the other day, and the same thing. When you talk to the people in charge right now, they all recognize the problem because they hear it from their constituents all the time, and they all want to act. So maybe we get lucky and there's too many choices to deal with. But I would just, encourage every developer here to go talk to your elected officials, wherever they are, because they are listening, and South Korea proved you can beat Apple and Google at this. We just need to replicate that more and make it happen.
And Andy, you're based in Switzerland. How about Switzerland?
Well, I have to say, Switzerland tends not to be the leader on issues like this, and more the follower. It's a very conservative Swiss approach, if you will, right? Obviously, I think within Europe, France is doing a very good job, right? It's won some important victories on behalf of publishers, and I think France does also have a lot of power, within Europe, and that can be effectively leveraged for things like this. But to echo what Mark is saying, it really has to be a global effort. And from the European perspective, we really need to view it from a standpoint of what we call digital sovereignty, right? We know that because of COVID and other things are happening, that the world is digitalization. That digitalization is occurring at a faster and faster pace, right? Every company has to go online, which means that every company, including your local bakery, is not long from now going to be a digital company. And today, digital really means mobile, and we have a digital economy, and which is dominated really just by two companies. And what this really means is, if we proceed down the path of digitalization, in 5 years, take France for example, who will control France's economy? The people of France or Apple and Google? And I think that's an important thing that we need to think about as we consider these issues.
Okay. And Andy, I have a question for you, because Apple argues that having less control over the App Store would mean less privacy and security for the users. And given that your company is a leader on security and privacy, what is your take on that?
Well, there's many different elements to the App Store, fight, and the answer is different for each of them, right? There are definitely some points where they have, legitimate points, but on the main one that I think most developers are, facing, and the ones that is causing direct consumer harm, which is, really the limitations on the payment services, the security arguments, do not really work, right? I think the South Korean example proves that to be the case. And when it comes to payment systems, at the end of the day, it's a credit card transaction that is being processed, right? Whether it's the developer taking the transaction or it's Apple doing it through Apple Pay, it's a very similar process, and the banking safeguards that are in place are actually quite similar. So I think what we'll see is really a lot of these arguments, at least on the payment issue, is not really true.
Okay. And Mark, you mentioned the South Korean law, which is very targeted on payments. Are there other pressing issues on the App Store that Match Group has identified?
Oh, I'm sure, we all see problems with the app stores, and there's a variety of things that need to be done. There's no transparency. It's a black box. You submit a build, you hope and pray that you get a good answer, you go back and forth. But I again, return to the payment issue, because it is symbolic of breaking open the monopoly. And once you start that, like I say, all sorts of things happen, all kinds of creativity. I just want to echo what Andy was saying about the digital economy. One of the things we've seen with COVID, with everybody going online that we haven't yet calculated, is what are the costs to the average household? What is the average household when you add up all those new fees and new services and all the new digital aspects? The cost is not going to be cheap. Every household is going to be hit by this. At the same time that people are struggling, the economy is adapting, we're all being asked to do things differently. You have two behemoths sitting in California bringing in record profits. I mean, it defies logic in lots of ways, and I think it's going to create a furor when all this is done and we return to what will be the new norm.
So we have only two minutes left, so maybe one last question. For a long time, smaller companies were afraid to speak up against big tech companies, not only Apple, but other ones. Do you get threats from Apple? Are they saying that if you continue being vocal, there will be retaliation? How is that? How does that work?
Yeah, well, the reality is that, Apple and Google today can kill any tech company if they wanted to, and there's very little that you can do from either legal or otherwise perspective to prevent that, right? And I think that statement alone should illustrate the depth of the problem that we're dealing with here.
Let me thank you, Andy. Thank the other truly small developers who work tirelessly on this. It's the small developer that has, 5 employees where the 30% means you're not hiring a 6th, or you're not able to offer better benefits. So there are real-world repercussions, but it is those small developers across the globe who have really made a difference because they're willing to take on these big guys and fight the fight. So, we thank them for being part of this, because without them, we wouldn't be making this progress today, and all of us are in this together.
Okay. Well, thank you to both of you, and thank you for attending this panel.